It's titled In Common. Thank you so much for being with us and for staying with us through the course. The mind can attain only what the seat can endure, so that's why we're trying to finish up on time so that you have many other things that you can do. But we hope that you'll be with us tomorrow. In the Sunday school class, I'll be talking about how to minister to the hurting, folks that are still living, but dealing with chronic illnesses or Alzheimer's or dementia or cancer or whatever. How do we help people who are living and their families as well? Lisa's class will be somewhere out this way, I believe, talking about how to help children and grandchildren deal with grief and loss. And that will be for adults, not for children, but to give you information and handouts that can help you with them. And then at the worship hour, we'll look at a biblical view of grief, especially John chapter 11. And then after lunch, talk about very practical things, 10 things that this congregation can do to help people in grief. And so we hope that you can be a part of all that. Somewhere on a piece of paper, I want you to write down 2 words. Again, you're not turning this in unless you want to, but 2 words. Okay, it's before the grief room. It's before the grief room. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, in common. I want you to write down 2 words. Grief is ... What is grief to you? Grief would be all kinds of different things in this room. But what is grief to you? Try to bring it on home, to make it personal for you. Maybe sometime tonight or sometime later on. Write down what grief is to you. That's often what I do in the class that I teach on a regular basis. And I want to read to you 2 different ladies and what they had to say about grief and to them. And I want you to tell me after I read this what you heard her saying. To me, grief is like falling into a bottomless pit, continuously hitting the sides and being cut by the sharp rocks. There's no end to the fall, and the pain never ceases. There's no light at the end of the tunnel, no way out. It's probably like living for an eternity in hell would be like. Nothing will ever be the same, and so you wonder, why go on? What did you hear from her statement? I'm sorry? Your desperation. Hopelessness. Isolation. Very true. That's a big one, but yes, ma'am, you're exactly right. Discombobulation. I don't know if I can spell that one or not, but yes, you're right. It's not all together. It's not going on. This was a lady, a mother-in-law, who was dealing with the loss of a son-in-law who had chosen to take his life. And those were her words, and that's how she felt in that manner. Now I want you to listen to this one. In the Webster's Dictionary, grief means a cause of such suffering, a mishap, or disaster. To grieve means sorrow. Since May 22nd, 1999 at 7:55 p.m., not only has suffering been a part of my daily life, but that day was the worst mishap and the greatest disaster of my entire life. Sorrow is something that awakens me in the morning, and it follows me everywhere all day, and it goes to bed with me at night. People say, stay busy. How much busier can one be than to take a college computer class, go to a grief support class, stay active in church and help people less fortunate than I? I feel sad for what I have lost. I feel poor for the empty space. I cry for what I cannot have. I am restless for my life is not whole. However, you cannot abandon the ship simply because you cannot control the winds. I am not going to give up on God. I am going to thank him for what I have left. What did you hear her say? Acceptance, hope, Yes, all those things. What was interesting is that in the original paper that she wrote, all the things that she said of a negative way were on one page, and then when it flipped the page, she said, however, you cannot abandon the ship simply because you cannot control the winds. And I thought that was so interesting, the way that she put it, that in the midst of the storm, God's either going to still the storm or he's going to calm his child. If you'll look at Psalm 107, verses 27 and 28, he tells us that for his people, he's going to be there, and he's going to help us, and he's going to provide for us. But her grief was so specific that she had even talked about the day and the date and the time. And what was so interesting is that this lady had endured the loss of two husbands. The first husband had died at age 25 in a boating accident, a drowning accident. The one that she said was the worst mishap of her entire life was the other husband, who died after 9 years of cancer. That to her, the anticipated loss, was far more significant and harder on her than the other loss. I thought that was interesting. She had told the story that the room in their house where the husband had been in a hospital bed, it had been there so long that when he had died and they ultimately came and removed the body and then ultimately removed the room, the bed, that there were dents in the carpet. And she said those dents in the carpet just spoke too loudly of what had happened. And so she said, I had to close off that room. I just couldn't go in it. About 3 months or so after that had happened, the 5-year-old grandson came to the house. And when he walked into the house, he said, why is Poppy's room closed? And before she could answer it, he just burst in and began to talk about all the good times that he had there in the bed of the grandfather and all the things that they would talk about and all the stories that they would tell. And he said, my grandson did in a matter of seconds what I could not have done for 3 months. Open up the door and talk about how he lived, not just how he died. And so that to her was the most significant loss in her life. What do people do to try to make it through the grief journey? Number one, they find someone to share their grief with. It's a lonely journey if you don't have friends and a church family to be there with you and for you. And so that's going to involve folks that have those who will be willing to be with them, to walk with them in their grief journey. For some cases, people have to find new friends because their old friends aren't willing to accept their grief. I knew of a lady who had to move to another church because they were not willing to accept her for the widow and the grief person that she was. She had been the preacher's wife. The husband had died. And so they kept on seeing her as the preacher's wife, not as a grieving widow. So she ultimately had to go to another congregation she talked about. Some people may in time choose to share their grief with a new mate. There are those who have done that. I knew a lady who had 4 Christian husbands, and 2 of them were brothers in the flesh as well as brothers in the Lord. And when I went to the last funeral at age 84 of her 4th Christian husband, later on she was visiting with her daughter who was a member of the church where I preached, and she said, Brother Don, do you think you can find me another Christian husband? I told that story to somebody and they said, who wants to marry her? You're going to die. 2 years later, she did pass away, and I had a partner funeral. Wonderful Christian lady, but she just always desired to have a Christian husband in her life. A lady was a resident at a nursing home, and there was a new male resident that moved in. And she walked up to him the first day and said, "You look like my third husband." And he said, "Third husband, how many have you had?" She said, "2." We cry a lot about grief, so it's good when we can laugh about stories like that. But you find someone to share your grief with. Secondly, they make a decision to move on. Moving on is not forgetting. You're not going to forget. Unless you lose your mind, you're not going to forget. Our fear is that others are. But we make the decision to move on with what is left. And again, that takes time. We're not talking 2 months. We're not talking 6 months. It's going to take a good while to work through your grief. But you make a decision to move on. Thirdly, you clean up relationships. After 9/11, there were some families that began to have monthly reunions, not waiting for once a year because you just never knew, in some cases, whether that person would be there. And so they clean up relationships and they try to be close to one another. Number 4, they become forgivers. You know, the Bible talks a great deal about forgiveness, Ephesians 4:32. You be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. Why? Even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. It's really important that we try to do that. Someone has said, he who cannot forgive destroys the bridge that he himself will one day must cross. And so it's really important. Now, yes, we have to hold fast to the doctrine. We have to hold fast to the Word of God. But we need to try to be as forgiving as possible. And with that comes number 5. They become amends makers. We don't use that word amends a great deal. But it's the idea of trying to get together. It's trying to get on the same page. It's trying to work together so that we can have reconciliation. When I was at Free-Hardeman, there was a wonderful professor by the name of Dowell Flatt. He taught Greek, but he also taught New Testament epistles. I was in Paul's epistles too, and he was talking about a statement found in Philippians chapter 4, verse 5. It reads, "Let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand." And he said, fellas, that word gentleness literally means you be willing to meet people halfway. You be willing to try to be the bridge that joins people together, to try to work things, not overlook, not say everything's right when in fact it's not. But you try to work with people to make them willing to try to be joined together, because life is so short and that is so important. And then number 6 perhaps is maybe the most important. Those who make it through grief learn that in giving, they receive. You see, first of all, grief has to be a mirror. Today, for the majority of people in this class, grief is a mirror. No one but you can know how great your loss is and what it costs you, what it has done to you. You let it be a mirror as long as it needs to be a mirror. As you begin to work through your grief and whatever, what you want it to do in time to come is for it to turn outward and become a window where you see the hurts of others and see your reflection in the glass. But that takes time, because first of all, grief is personal. And so you let it be a mirror as long as it needs to be a mirror. Don't let people shortchange your grief. Don't let people say, it's been 6 months, you should be over. Just when they say that, realize that they don't understand grief, because in most cases, they would not be making that statement. But eventually, by giving of yourself, even in the throes of grief, you help others, and you also receive something in return. Helen Keller, who lived in Tuscumbia, Alabama, about 20 miles from where I live, Has any of you been to the play in the backyard of her house? I think a few of you have. It's well worth going to. June on Friday and Saturday nights, and also the first 2 weeks in July. It'd be a great thing for you to do. But she made the statement, as long as you sweeten someone else's pain, life is not in vain. That's from a lady, who lost her sight very early in life, who, could communicate only by spelling out words. Where she spells out water, that place is literally there, and that water cistern is right there in her backyard. And so it's a very, very good outdoor play. In giving, you receive. Bill McDonald, who helped start us in this work, tells of a lady who had lost her husband suddenly in a car accident. And he did the funeral, and then for weeks afterwards and months, he would try to counsel her. And she didn't want to move past the immediacy of the loss. And so as a counselor, he did something somewhat profound. He basically said, don't come back to me until you are willing to talk about life now, not the way it was, but life now because of your loss. He didn't see her for a couple of months, and then one day he heard her before he saw her. She'd come into the outer office. He could hear her talking and laughing with the girls out there. And then she came to his office, and she had a big smile on his face, which he had not seen in months. And he said, what have you done? Do you have a new dress? No. Have you done something to your hair? No. Well, come in and tell me about it. So she sat down, and she said, I thought about what you've been saying. And so last night I made 12 dozen chocolate chip cookies. Oh, you're on a sugar high. No. I made 12 dozen chocolate chip cookies. I put out 12 aluminum pans. I put a dozen here, dozen here, wrapped them all up, and took them to 12 families that were hurting. Now, what was the point? Her mirror had turned outward. She could see the hurts of others. And by helping them, she was helping herself. In this room today, there are people that will be able to help people in the throes of grief that I will never be able to do because I haven't had the loss or losses that you have. And perhaps out of the midst of your sorrows in time, you'll be able to minister to people and to help people, and in some cases help people find Christ that perhaps no one else could because of the losses that you deal with. In grief, people make it by giving and by receiving at the end. Stories talk about this little boy that was walking down a country road and saw a big sign, puppies for sale. So he walked up the lane to the house, and the man came out and he said, sir, do you have puppies here? He said, he do. He said, what kind are they? He said, they're registered puppies. He said, well, how much do they cost? He said, well, they cost a lot. He said, well, I've got 39 cents. You think I could see one of your puppies? Yeah, you can see him. So he called for the mother dog. Come on, Dolly. Dolly came out, and here came all these fat, furry puppies running behind the mother dog. And as he looked, he noticed that all of them were running real fast except one that was walking real slow, and he was a lot slower to get to where all the other puppies were. He said, sir, you've got some mighty fine puppies. And then he pointed to that one that was walking real slow. He said, how much is that puppy for sale? And the man said, sir, you don't want that puppy, son. He said, it was born with a bad leg. It's not going to be able to walk and play and run like all the other puppies. He said, you really don't want to buy that puppy. The little boy reached down to his pants leg and pulled up the pants leg, and you could see a steel rod from the very bottom of his foot all the way up his leg. He said, that puppy's going to need somebody like me to love him and to understand what it's like not to be able to run and not to be able to play. Sir, how much is that puppy? And the man said, there's no price for love. The puppy's yours. Sometimes grief does things to us, physically, mentally, emotionally. But out of the throes of our own grief, sometimes by giving of ourselves to others, we're able to help people that no one else would be able to help. Number 7, folks who make it through grief learn to live in the present moment. You know, over in Philippians 3, Paul, through the mind of God, is talking about his past. He says, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forth to those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. You ever stop to think about what he could not forget that had happened in the past? Paul was Saul the persecutor. He was the one that thought he was doing right by going into Christian homes and hauling out moms and dads and putting them in prison. Some of them perhaps dying. He was the one that's holding the clothes as they stoned Stephen, the righteous man, to death. He thought he was doing the right thing, but he had blood on his hands. And yet he said, forgetting those things which are behind. Folks who make it through grief learn to live in the present moment. And then number 8, they share their new feeling of life with others. There is light at the end of the tunnel. They're called creative survivors or wounded healers. Folks that go through grief, that grow through grief, and then help others in the midst of it. William Faulkner wrote a book entitled Wild Palms. And in that book, he made a statement, between grief and nothing, I will take grief. A lot of times in grief, you have to answer that question. With all the pain, with all the heartache that I deal with, if I had a choice at the beginning, which we don't, would I rather them not have ever lived because of the grief that I feel now about their loss? Between grief and nothing, I will take grief. Or as Alfred Lord Tennyson put it, it is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. In my grief class, I say, that's a question that you have to answer. It's a question that you have to deal with. But folks who make it through grief share that new feeling of life. I'm sure there's a cemetery not too far from here. And if you go to that cemetery today, you will find those tombstones having all kinds of names on them. And typically 2 dates, the day in which a person was born and the day in which that person died. And in some cases, if it's a husband and wife, you may find that on one side, but on the other side, the day of birth, but beside it is a dash, right? And right now, that's who we are. We're living the dash. It's up to us to live that dash as long as we can to the honor and glory of God. We don't know when it's going to happen. God does know, unless he sends his son in judgment before then. But we're living our dash. And so whoever we are, whatever we're dealing with, even with the losses that we have and the grief journey that we must take, the greatest way that we can honor God and our loved ones is to live a life of honor and purpose. Earl Groman, a Jewish rabbi, made that statement, the greatest monument you will ever erect is to live a life of meaning and purpose in honor of your deceased. And so my hope is that's what you will choose to do, and that what we have said today will give you ammunition or information to help you in your present journey. In 6 hours, last night and then today, there's no way that we can say from A to Z, now you've got it all. No, it's just the beginning of it. But my hope is that something we have said has been of some help to you, and that you'll come back tomorrow for more of the information. Some of you during the breaks have shared your stories with me, and for that I am grateful. And I'll be more than glad to stay around as long as possible. But Brent, I want to turn it over to you for any final words that you want to say. And then, again, thank you so much for coming. Feel free to look at the books if you're interested, and look forward to talking with you.
Don, before you step away, tell the folks how they will purchase the books if they want them.
Okay. Lisa's already here. It has some change if you need them. Hope for those who struggle, that deals with all kinds of different losses. Loss of a parent, loss of a spouse, the loss of children, loss through cancer, SIDS, miscarriage, suicide. That's what that book deals with. Walking with Those Who Weep is 101, we call it. 13 chapters. Some people have used it in Bible classes. But it deals with all kinds of things, including anticipated loss, sudden loss, where is God in the midst of suffering, grief in the holidays, and so many other chapters. And then we wrote a little booklet right before COVID hit, and it's $1. And then this book on the end is Golden Bubbles, written by Edna Butterfield, a lady from the Free Hardeman campus. She lost a granddaughter, and so she dealt with that book, and we wanted to bring that in her memory and honor, and it's $9 if you're interested. So feel free to see me. I'll be glad to autograph anything if you'd like to, and you can make out the checks to Rondon Books or myself, as the case may be, or she's got change if you want to give cash. But yes, thank you so much for mentioning that.
We appreciate you being here, and just want to say a word of great appreciation to Don for all of his many hours and many years of study, research, and caring about people, experiences with people that he has gained insights from, and his willingness to come and to share that with us. And we appreciate him for opening up himself to us, because I've seen many of you coming up here and talking to him, and he's a person who genuinely cares and wants to listen, and we appreciate him so much. Hope that you'll be back tomorrow. You will hear him at the Sunday morning Bible class hour. If you would like to go to the auditorium, his wife Lisa will be teaching the class in the Friendship Farm Room to a group of ladies who would be interested in talking to children about grief and loss, and she's going to be sharing those insights tomorrow. And also, after our fellowship lunch, we will be meeting for our evening service at 12:30 back in the main auditorium, and Don will be speaking one final time then, and the focus is going to be what this congregation can do to help those that are struggling with grief. So we will be benefited from that also. Now, before we close, we need some help. So some of you